Hi, everybody. Thank you for being here. Friday night, I could think of many better things to do. Um, um, Thank you, Jakob, also for inviting me. This was a big surprise, actually. The interview turned out to be kind of an accident. It was a friend of a friend that found out something about the book and just decided to talk at length about it, and then we scheduled a formal interview. We talked for, I don't know, maybe 3 hours or something like that. And then some people read it, apparently, which was a pleasant surprise. Okay, so Jakob suggested that I be controversial with my title, and so this is as close as I could get to the grand unified theory of everything. So prepare to be disappointed. I currently live in the United States. This is a slightly distorted map of it, right about there in the state of Michigan, in a town called Ann Arbor, where the University of Michigan is based. The best spots in town can be seen on the map. It's the golf course, Arboretum. This is an arcade where you play video games. I don't know why it's so prominent on Google Map, but it tells you maybe about our priorities. So it's a very old university, actually. It was established before the state of Michigan was established in 1817. Not as old as many of the European universities, obviously, but it's a very beautiful place. So if you happen to be in Michigan or nearby, or fly through Detroit, feel free to send me an email. Come by, and if I'm around, I'll give you a little tour if I can, and happy to have a discussion. We're very famous, obviously, for the football. This is where alumni loyalty really comes from. Seats about 109,000 people, one of the biggest stadiums in the world. So we actually have some World Cup and Premier League soccer teams come in the summertime and do matches there, and over 100,000 people show up. It's kind of fun. We also have a really important bar in town that's called Heidelberg. So you can come, I'll take you there, you'll feel at home. So I'm going to skip this slide. I'll just show a bit of my affiliation. Should be not associated anymore. I'm in for life at this point. I'm full professor. I get distracted easily, which is so this thing on innovation is a bit of a distraction that's taken me on a long detour for many years away from my normal job that involves condensed matter physics and devices like OLEDs, and now we're doing something in pharmaceutical technology. But it is interesting, so I want to talk a bit about this. So here's a quote from Paul Getty. He was the richest. He was Bill Gates and Jeff Bezos in the 70s. His formula for success had several components. So two of the components were rise early, work hard, and strike oil. So work hard, but be lucky, right? And so part of what I'm puzzled about is, what's really luck? How much of people's success is attributable to luck? And what do you have to do in the meantime, right? What does it mean to rise early, work hard? It's obviously better to work in an oil field as opposed to somewhere else, right? If your objective is to strike oil. So how do you spot what the next big thing might be? Where is that next big oil field? So in that regard, there's something interesting that's been happening in the last few decades. So if you look at a list of companies, Fortune 500 companies in 1976, the top of the heap are the traditional manufacturing and extraction and production companies. ExxonMobil is at the top, Texaco, Mobil, Chevron, Texaco, Gulf Oil. So actually, a tremendous number of these things have to do with oil, right? Energy companies in the old sense. And then there are car companies. And you go down the list and it's more oil companies. Apple computer was founded in 1976. I was born in 1976, so you can do the math on how old I am and tell me afterwards, because I keep forgetting. So around the same time where the only computer company around of note was IBM, International Business Machines. Kind of interesting. So I did a sabbatical recently, and I did some travel. There's an Apple museum in the Czech Republic. It's not sanctioned by Apple. It's just somebody that really likes Apple. They opened an Apple museum, and they have one of everything. And I really enjoyed visiting it, in part because, so there's some interesting quotes in there. So Steve Jobs, it turns out, went to Homestead High School in Cupertino, California. It's the same high school that I went to when I was in high school in California. So Steve Jobs and Steve Wozniak, have this thing, the high school that I went to, and the high school had always Macintosh computers, even when they were not the best computers. Here's a quote: "I'm certainly not going to waste my tomorrows worried about my yesterdays. It's a wasteful use of energy and productivity." He cashed out a little bit early, I guess you could say. Anyway, so how can you tell? Are you in the right business or are you in the wrong business, right? So that was interesting. That's me, selfie. So here's a 1998 list of Fortune 500 companies. Again, you see General Motors, Ford Motor Company, Exxon still up there, Walmart starting to get interesting, General Electric, but still mostly traditional machines, and still a lot of oil companies. The reason I bring up 1998 is that Google was founded in 1998. Okay, so web search was not really a thing at all in terms of being prominent in the economy. If you look more recently, this 2017, if you look at the largest companies by market value, that's Apple, that's Google, that's Microsoft, that's Amazon, investment, Facebook, and only then do you get some of the traditional companies. It's really interesting. Here's a bit of news recently. China's Meituan Dianping acquires bike-sharing firm Mobike for $2.7 billion. Right? So, I know a lot of people ride bikes in China, but bike sharing, everybody already has a bike in a way, right? Why $2.7 billion? So it's a little bit puzzling, and of course you probably know the answer because you've been reading. A lot of it has to do with information. So information is the new oil, and something interesting has been happening recently in the world of economics is that the rise of investment in so-called intangible assets has been going faster and faster, while investment in the so-called tangible assets has been going down. Value add, that's the amount of investment, intangible versus tangible. And what we're talking about in terms of intangible, what do we mean by intangible assets? So intangible assets have to do with data, generating intellectual property, finding out where resources are, design, training of various kinds. So really about information and less about physical things and physical goods. And in 1996, Brian Arthur, very, very well-known, very influential economist, wrote a paper called Increasing Returns and Two Worlds of Business. And in it he said, I quote, "The underlying mechanisms that determine economic behavior have shifted from ones of diminishing to ones of increasing returns." So I'll discuss that in a second. And he adds, "The tendency for that which is ahead to get further ahead, and for that which loses advantage to lose further advantage." So if you start getting big and you start gaining advantage in the marketplace, the dynamics are such that you get further ahead and you win everything. And if you fall behind, you just get way behind. So what it looks like is kind of like this. So new technologies now start coming into the marketplace. Objectively, actually, people study this. They objectively see new technologies coming into the marketplace at ever faster rates. But the diffusion curve, if you will, the technology diffusion curve, looks something like this. It's initially very slow and then starts rising very, very fast, exponentially. And then it reaches an inflection point and levels off. And then what happens, rather than the slope of this line changing for the better, what happens is you have some new technological breakthrough, and the world jumps onto a new technological curve. And so when we talk about the law of diminishing returns, we talk about older established technologies. This is the part of the curve that we're talking about. So Brian Arthur says that the traditional companies, the extraction-based companies, manufacturing-based companies, and so on, they primarily at this stage operate in this region of the curve. And so if you want to sell more coffee, you have to raise more coffee beans and transport. And so in some ways, sales of coffee compete with this primary resource. And so you end up in a trade-off situation. We're going to come back to that aspect. So really, the question is, when this is occurring, when you find yourself in this spot, what's next? What do you jump in? And not only that, what sort of skills do you acquire in order to be able to do that? And I care about this because I'm teaching students, right? So I'm at the university, I teach courses, people come in, they say, what should I study, professor? Well, definitely not what I studied when I was younger. So this is an interesting fact. And this is just a fact of modern economics based on technology, is that there's a winner-takes-all dynamic. If you look at social networks, it's Facebook and maybe Twitter, and that's it, right? Instagram was bought by Facebook. If you look at search, web search, it's primarily Google, and everybody else doesn't really matter. In smartphones, chances are you have either an Apple phone or a Samsung phone, and even in the Apple phone, the display is made by Samsung. Right? Nobody else matters. Online or regular book sales, you have Amazon, Barnes & Noble, and everything else is in the noise. So this kind of thing keeps happening, right? So let's sort of put that aside for now. Now the question is, and on my title slide, I showed these pictures of ancient Greeks, and the depiction here on the vases are. Can anybody guess which legend this refers to? Yeah, Battle of Troy, and Odysseus, the Odyssey, right? So, and so it's a little bit weird to bring them up, right? So one question might be, what did these people do for a living? How did they earn their money, so to speak? And of particular interest, I think, today that I want to highlight is this passage from the Iliad. Achilles, who's the hero in that story, says the following: I carry two sorts of destiny toward the day of my death. Either if I stay here and fight beside the city of the Trojans, my return home is gone, but my glory shall be everlasting. But if I return home to the beloved land of my fathers, the excellence of my glory is gone, but there will be a long life left for me, and my end and death will not come to me quickly. Right, so the key parts are here. I'm going to highlight them. So my return home is gone, but my glory shall be everlasting. So I'm going to die, but I'll achieve glory. Or I'm going to return home. I will not fight in this battle. I'm going to live a long life, because I won't die in battle, but nobody's just going to know about me. Okay? That's known as a trade-off. Right? So we all know that life is full of trade-offs. It's also known as opportunity cost, or if you get into engineering and manufacturing or design, it's called a Pareto Optimization or Pareto efficiency. And usually it refers to a situation where you have, and I'm fond of two-dimensional plots, so I apologize in advance if I show too many of them, but basically you want a lot of one thing and a lot of another thing. And for whatever reason, they happen to be competing with each other for some primary resource. Right? In America, it's known as you can't have your cake and eat it too. You either hold your cake or you eat your cake. At the end, you can't have both. So using this two-dimensional diagram, we can take that situation that's described and map it. So the plot looks like that, right? So one option is you're maximizing glory and you're minimizing years of life. And the other option is you're maximizing years of life, but you're minimizing glory. There's a trade-off, okay? And that happens all the time. In design, it's a conflicting desires situation. We can diagram these kinds of things. And the thesis here is that true big innovations, things that go up the exponential part of the S-curve for innovation, are ones that break the trade-off, where you can have your cake and eat it too. Here's an example of the blue point on the curve. Eumaeus, who's another character in the story, herd pigs. He raises pigs. He's a commoner. Oh, pardon me. He's a commoner, and he enjoys a normal life, right? So low on glory, very high in years. Okay, so he's on this location in the plot. Achilles, that we already talked about, he is engaged in combat. He scores low on years, but everybody knows about him. He's glorious, right? And so the question is, can we have both? And in order to do that, it turns out that in mathematics, there's a theory called category theory that, in principle, tells you that you may always be able to come up with an answer. And for that, you need to lift yourself out of the box, so to speak, and try to understand what the bigger category is. Okay? And so you can map your situation onto a diagram that talks about a larger category. So a person is a larger category than a commoner, because a commoner is a kind of person. A life could be a normal person's life or a hero's life, right? And so this is the more general category. And there's some pair of numbers that measure a life that you're after. In this case, it's about years in glory, but you could measure life in other ways too, right? Like how many cats do you have, that kind of thing. So Achilles, same thing, maps onto this more general category. And so then there's an innovation in the ancient Greek world. Homer, who wrote the original story, understood the dilemma. And he said, now I need a breakthrough of some sort. I need a technological breakthrough that lets me have my cake and eat it too. And so he comes up with a concept, with an invention or an innovation of the polytropos. Tell me muse of a man of many ways. And so he develops Odysseus, who is a warrior, strategist, seafarer, storyteller, negotiator, lover, husband, pretender, all these things. And he gives him an odyssey. He gives him a theater of play where he can go and practice all these things. But he's not going to do it alone. He actually has a team. And so because he's very skilled in all these different areas, he can hire people, if you will, that will carry out the actual job that needs to be done day to day, right? So there's a strategy being implemented. So it's a team effort, right? When he's going through a passage and the sirens are singing, he has people tie him to the mast. And so he decouples navigation, for example, from enjoyment of the song. So the mapping is still there. He's a new kind of hero. He's still a person. He's still engaged in a life. It's just that it's a different kind of life. And he ends up scoring particularly high on these variables that are defining the life. And so this is a true innovation, right? And results in a lot of success. It turns out that these situations occur again and again and again. If you look at the book market in the 90s, you had Barnes & Noble that was facing a big trade-off. So consumers wanted more choice for books. That means you needed to have a bigger store. If you wanted people to go into your store, you needed to be in a very populated area. So real estate was very expensive. And so you have a trade-off, right? They try to create hangout space, but it's expensive. It's at the cost of books. It's at the cost of prices. You know what comes next. Amazon comes along and says, oh, well, that's the trade-off, more consumer choice, bigger and more expensive store. we're going to invent an online store, easy purchasing, maybe auctions and so on and so forth. But really, you're decoupling the choice of books from the price of the store. And so effectively, everybody starts buying books from Amazon. I'm a book person. I don't necessarily think that's the best thing ever, but the reality is I buy a majority of my books on Amazon, not in an actual bookstore. So that particular innovation actually results in a huge jump in scale, huge jump in purchasing. This is a video, I'm not going to play it because of time constraints, but if you actually watch a video from 2005 of Jeff Bezos, he talks about this stuff. So they hit a new normal where they have so many customers and they're driving the price so low that inevitably run into the situation of very poor service, right? If you go to a bookstore, there's a person there you can talk to if you have an issue. Amazon, who do you talk to? It's an online store. So people start having poor experience. So they face this challenge on how to actually improve customer service and improve the overall experience, but keep reducing prices and increasing scale. And he talks about how they actually did that. And at the foundation of that is this idea that they're rejecting that there has to be necessarily conflict between those two. They have to be able to resolve it. If you look at cars, the car industry in the 1900s, General Motors was the dominant player, right? And if you wanted to build a better quality car that was also reliable, you had to have very skilled laborers assembling the car, making sure that everything's tight and fitting together and working properly, right? And it was very expensive. And so quality and reliability came at a higher price. That's the trade-off. Along comes Henry Ford and says, well, look, let's make a few compromises. You can have your car in any color as long as it's black, black, or black, right? There's one model. Right? There's going to be one model. But we're going to build it with very high quality. We're going to standardize parts. We're going to assemble it in a way that gives us better quality and reliability and at a lower price, right? And so everybody likes it. And so it scales. The idea scales. Of course, now we end up in another plateau where adding more cars to the road is not really doing anybody any good, right? Because there's traffic congestion, environmental damage, and so on. But that initial rise, that initial exponential, is because a person broke a trade-off. You can see this happening if you zoom into the car situation right now. You see similar sorts of things happening, right? It used to be a horse-drawn carriage. Now it's a horseless carriage. And you can steer it by the steering wheel, which is actually quite remarkable because this might have a few horsepower, right? More horsepower than this. And yet it's just as easy to steer as if it had 1 horsepower. So control is decoupled from power. Now you have cars that have, Bugatti, I think, has 1,000 horsepower, 1,001 horsepower. And it's just as easy to steer as this thing that has a few horsepower. So again, you broke the trade-off between the difficulty of controlling this thing and the number of horses that you have in there. User interfaces also evolve. Obviously you have these things. And that speaks to another dynamic that's under that has to do with innovation in products and also innovation in processes. And usually process innovation kind of lags in product innovation as far as user experience goes because users get used to certain kinds of things. So when people get used to doing this, that's fine. Everybody has a car. Everybody knows how to do that. That's easy, right? Super easy to be able to steer a car with many horses under the hood. Then everybody gets this, and this becomes super easy. Now, both things are so easy, you really want to do both of them together. And this is a big problem in the US right now. Maybe less so in Europe, but this is a huge, huge problem in the US. And so this is the kind of thinking that we started applying to some of the research that we've been doing in my lab, in collaborations with other people's labs. We started actually looking for difficult problems. We started looking for problems that have these kinds of hard trade-offs. So I want to show just a couple of examples and then maybe summarize and maybe have a discussion. So here's one example, solar panels. There's basically 2 types of solar cells that are prevalent in the market. One is you have a ground-mounted panel that can tilt. Right? So it does this. And it does it to follow the sun. because it turns out you could get almost 40% more energy over the course of the day out of a panel of a given size and a given cost if you tilt it and follow the sun. Alternatively, you can put a panel on a rooftop. And if you're putting a panel on a rooftop, you're not going to tilt the panel. Okay? So you're losing out potentially a lot of energy during the day. So again, you have this, a design trade-off. You can either have something that tilts and gathers more energy, or you can have something that's slim and stationary and goes on the rooftop. And so we want to have our cake and eat it too. So what we're going to do is use an invention technique where we take this and we break it down into smaller units, smaller subunits, and we mount those subunits on a roof, and then we're going to tilt. But we do it in a very manufacturable way. So here's an example of using kirigami technology or kirigami art to cut the panel into lots of small pieces. And when you stretch it, as long as some of those pieces are connected in a way that you see here, the individual elements actually tilt, and it allows you to follow the sun just by stretching the panel. But the profile stays very small. So it turns out that it works really well. We've done some calculations, fabrication and testing of these solar cells. So these are actual high-efficiency gallium arsenide solar cells that are made on a flexible sheet. And when you stretch them, they tilt and they follow the sun. And so what you see here is, normally if you look at the power generated by a solar panel, it's very little in the morning because the sun is low on the horizon. It rises, it peaks at noon, and then it goes down at sunset. If you have a tilting panel, that's the outer black curve over here. And the shaded area represents the extra energy that you're going to harvest during the day by doing that. And so this stretchable kirigami, depending on how you cut it, this stretchable sheet can also essentially almost match entirely what you're getting up there. So same thing in medicine right now, in particular in pharmaceuticals. So if you look at pharmaceuticals, there's a big trade-off that has to do with customizability and scalable manufacturing. If you want your medicines cheap, you have to manufacture them at scale in a batch process where everyone is exactly the same, right? That's standardization. That's what Henry Ford did. The thing about medicine is that everybody's got something different, right? And everybody's different in terms of how they react to different medicines. They feel different during the day or during week, during month. Their particular set of conditions is different. And so you actually need to be able to customize the medicine and tune it to each person specifically. In cancer, it's very common actually for the cancer to mutate, and the mutation is different for each person depending on their genetic makeup. And so you need to customize the mixture of drugs that the person is given. It's not just one drug anymore. People are given drug cocktails that contain 4, maybe 5 different active ingredients to fight the cancer. But things are changing in time also. So what you're fighting in the initial period is different from what you're fighting several months later, because the cancer mutates also. And so you have this really big pressing need for customizability, but when you look at the cost, especially cancer treatment, it's super expensive. And so again, there's a trade-off situation. And so what can we do about it? I don't think we have the only answer, but we have some ideas for how to do that. And the important part is that we're deciding to tackle that challenge. We say, well, we normally think it's too difficult, but we're going to attack that problem. And so we have a paper that we published recently in 2017 where we simply heat the active ingredients, including cancer drugs. We just heat them so they begin to evaporate. And we use nitrogen gas. It's very cheap, cheaper than beer, to dry deposit these organic molecules onto a surface, any surface. And you can combine as many of them as you need. And we feel it's a very scalable process that is going to help us resolve this trade-off. So I don't want to take too long. I want to wrap it up here and just highlight these key points. Number one, I think we can all agree that life is full of trade-offs. But it's also true that you can break those trade-offs and you can have your cake and eat it too in some situations. You have to train for how to do that. You have to usually employ a team of people eventually to do that. But the really important change is a change in mindset where you don't avoid trade-offs or you don't optimize within the trade-off box, is to actually look for these trade-offs and then try to break them. And that's an important switch in the mindset. And we think it's a necessary switch. And then understanding that new solutions that break these old trade-offs eventually get up to that plateau region of the innovation curve, right? And then it becomes scaled up, and you have mass adoption, and then people begin to expect something even better, another 10x jump in capability. And so this is going to be repeated, right? So we're gonna then start back up here, and we're gonna repeat this process. And I think that this perspective is necessary because you have a dramatic change now happening in terms of the kinds of jobs that are available, the kinds of jobs that are growing for people. And so whereas people used to do this a lot, and I love machining and I love tinkering in my own workshop, working on bikes, working on other things, working on my rackets and so on. But increasingly, you need new skills to be able to do this in an industrial environment, or to be able to do new things that you haven't been able to do before. Driving, that's changing. Decisions about medicine and a course of treatment are now being done in consultation with artificial intelligence, increasingly. Some of the things that we had to derive by hand, I could just plug it into Mathematica and get an answer, right? So things have to change. And having students come through the university, realizing this, that we need a big shift in mentality, is a really important thing. And so I'm trying to push this idea that we need a new kind of smart creatives, essentially people who are aware of this polytropos mentality, who are going to do this again and again. There's lots of other stuff that we discuss in the book, but tonight I just want to finish it up here, and I'd be happy to take your questions and have a discussion. Thank you. Give it a minute. Maybe in part I'm stating things that are kind of obvious, but nobody's willing to teach that. I teach design. One of the classes I've taught for well over a decade with over 1,000 students that go through it is engineering design. And I also collaborate with faculty in School of Art and Design and School of Architecture, where we have students sometimes work together, other departments within engineering. And engineering design, people realize, trade-offs, okay, we have to make trade-offs. And you have this traditional approach to rank customer desires. And so the first thing that the engineering students need to learn is to go and interview the customer. What does the customer want? And that's a really big thing for an engineer to do. You understand, right? Engineers, generally don't like talking to people. So, because we're analytical, right? And we like math and computers and things like that. And so now you need to go and talk to people. And they tell you qualitative things. They say, well, it kind of hurts when I do this. And then you have to translate that into hard numbers. It could be the elasticity of something. It could be the dimension of something. Color preferences, how do you quantify those? So you have to be able to do that. And that's a difficult step. And then people learn that, our engineers learn that there are many things that people want at the same time, but not all to the same degree. And so there's a new concept that they have to learn that has to do with prioritization of customer desires and customer requirements. And so they do that. And then the traditional instruction is, well, now you find the optimum. You have to find the optimum, meaning that in that Pareto curve, you find out where that envelope is and you stay within it. You figure out where you can make the most dollars within that envelope. And what often happens is that people that realize that they can break through that Pareto envelope end up making 10 times or 100 times as much money. Daimler, Mercedes-Benz, Daimler-Benz, he had a trade-off back in the day. Was that he wanted windshields, glass windshields for his cars, but the price of glass was very, very expensive. And so he instituted a recycling program. He actually paid people to bring in wine bottles and beer bottles, and he would use that glass to make windscreens. It had an unintended consequence in that it took a lot of broken glass off of the roads, and so motorists could actually drive more enjoyably. And so everybody was happy. Daimler was very happy because he had a cheaper source of glass. The motorists were happy because there's no broken glass, and the drunks were really happy because they got some money back. So oftentimes these things can occur. Money is an interesting example of breaking a trade-off. Do you ever think about that? Money is weird. What I mean by that is that money has to be scarce, like gold in the old days when people were just coming up with different materials for money. Gold is really good because it's scarce. But if it's too scarce, it's useless because people can't use it as a medium of exchange. You can't grow trade if there's not enough money, the actual material, to denote that. And so money has to strike an interesting balance. And what you see with introduction of paper money, for example, or introduction of credit, and a monetary system that's decoupled from the gold standard, for example, is that it breaks that kind of trade-off. So now you can have growth in trade that's decoupled from the limitations of that physical resource. I don't know. I'm still kind of puzzled by these things.
Yes. Yes.
The example of a university or training, yes. So if you teach to a large group, then it's cheaper, yes, it's affordable, but it's not very effective, efficient, because everybody has a different background, interests, and so on. And if you have an individual tutor, learning languages, for instance, or whatever you do, yes, so it's highly effective, but very low efficiency and very costly, yes. And then if you look for this optimum thing, innovation, there comes to my mind this Khan, where you go
Khan
to
Academy,
the internet, where you can make through the internet individual progress, depending on your own capabilities or speed. Yeah. So, did you think about your own area of competency and acting as a professor, how to deal with this dilemma?
That's a yes. So let me show this page here. What happened? Okay, so I used to teach. So courses I taught: quantum mechanics, senior design, the smart surfaces course, organic electronics, entrepreneurship. I taught solid state physics also for graduate students. So this has a lot to do with my area of research also, and it's a very important part of materials science. At some point I had a realization that when I was trying to explain something for my students, I was trying to illustrate what happens, but the phenomenon was dynamic. And so when I drew it on the blackboard, it didn't really get across this idea of a dynamic aspect of this concept. So I went on YouTube and I found a video that explained it beautifully. And I played it for my students. And that started happening with an alarming frequency. I discovered that there are better explanations. So I'm bragging a little bit. This is a very American trait that I've adopted. I'm bragging about myself a lot. So I got these awards: excellence in education, excellence in teaching, and I thought I was a really good professor, right? And so I did this, and I said, you know what? I don't want to teach this anymore. It's really important for a lot of the research that I do. I think it's really important for students of material science and engineering. But I don't think that I'm the best person to do this, and I don't think it's the best use of my time. So I don't want to teach this class anymore, really. I had this. However, design is still really difficult to do online. And so I shifted a lot of my effort into design. Right now I'm teaching a class that I call The Greatest Materials of Civilization. If you had to start a new civilization, what materials would you take with you? and why. You know, what happened when you had big leaps in our civilization? What materials were involved, and what makes them so useful at those instances? I think eventually that class could go on YouTube. But I still think that things like design, that's still very difficult. Maybe with augmented reality and telepresence and things like that, we'll eventually get there with digital manufacturing, but we're not there yet. And so, to your question, yeah, I changed the way I teach, and I changed what I teach because of that. Yeah, it's a really big thing. If you're a university professor, you have to ask yourself, why are we paid to do this stuff, right?
I would be interested in your perspective on how to tackle it. So most innovation, also the examples that you showed, are basically a combination of one of those trade-offs that you described and some technology. So what would you recommend? Looking at technology and then searching for trade-offs to break, or looking at trade-offs and then finding technologies to do it?
Yeah, that's a good question. Oftentimes, when I talk to students who are interested in entrepreneurship and also colleagues, and there's this general discussion that happens that I would call, or people call, product market fit. Let's say somebody comes up with a technology, and they say, does it fit here? Does it fit here? Does it fit here? You know, I have something that I discovered in the lab. You know, what should I use it for, right? And then there's the other side of, here's a problem. And people have tried this, and they've tried this, and they've tried this, but the problem stays, right? The problem sticks. What do I do that's really going to solve that? It comes up again and again and again. Yeah, I don't have a good answer yet, I think, for this. I actually, it depends on the personality, right? Because some people go very deep into an area and they become an expert in a particular area, and some people are generalists, right? And they do this stuff. The big objective that I have when students come in is I say, okay, that's a trade-off, right? It's a trade-off in education that we're choosing to make, but we don't have to have that trade-off. A colleague of mine, Mark Brangersma, at Stanford calls them T-shaped people, people that can do a survey when needed and then dive deep when needed. So there's a shift in the mindset. So what I do now is I look at problems, I look at the problem space, I pick a really interesting problem, and then I try to figure out if my skill set is sufficient for doing that, or if I need to team up with other people, or I just need to appreciate the problem from a distance. But I think we need to get to a point where people can do both equally well, because that's a trade-off on the education side. Does that answer your question, or at least talks near your question? You know, so you look at these things, right? You basically, if you want to find a good problem, you look at it and you say, people want to be here, but we're stuck here. We want to be here. So something's coming, right? Something is coming. In medicine, something is coming. We don't know yet. In higher education, something also is coming. In scientific publishing, we're here. People write a lot of papers, they don't read any papers. It's a real issue right now. There's a ton of stuff being published. Nobody reads anything. So something is coming. There's a lot of news. You can get your news in a millisecond. You could get a lot of news. How do you know which is true? Or what to do about it? That's another thing, right? So we've reached a saturation point in a lot of different things, and we need to come up with ways of breaking through that. So something is going to happen, right? There's a lot of interesting problems right now.
Probably a little bit more naive, but I met earlier this year a guy from Samsung in San Francisco. And I thought, he was close to major universities. and Stanford and Berkeley and other great universities, they're not at all interested in the research done there. What they are specializing in is in failures. People, they acknowledge, analyze failures, and then take them up or buy them. And then actually, at least the compound in San Francisco is based on people who did not achieve, or probably sort of the first step of Steve Jobs. You know, you would realize there is something evident, but he couldn't do it at the time. So we take him up and use that. Our expertise is managerial, predicting the potential, and that's it. But what kind of role would that play in the process of the success?
Certainly Silicon Valley, for one, is full of failures, right? For every one that succeeds, for every Facebook, every PayPal, every one of these companies that makes it big, there's many spectacular failures and many smaller failures. The one thing that is different about Silicon Valley from virtually any other place in the world has to do with the fact that culturally it's acceptable to fail. Culturally, it's acceptable to fail, where you can be sitting in a cafe, you're discussing something with a friend, and you say, I just crashed my company because, this didn't, the next round of funding didn't come in, or this customer, canceled the order, or, an engineer left, or something like that happened, or a patent didn't get allowed. And somebody will turn around and say, welcome to the club. What are you doing next? And it's okay to jump back into the pool of people trying to do the next thing. And it's very different from a lot of other places in the world where people laugh at you if you failed. And so it generates a kind of culture that is, on a fundamental level, much more capable of coming up with the next big thing. I think that's really important. There are some venture capitalist firms and people that simply will not give money to anyone who has not crashed a company previously. They want to see that, they want the person to understand and experience the pain of failure, and to absorb some lessons from that, and have a desire to do something again, simply because they can't help themselves, right, to do it again. So they have that desire, but they want to make it work. So there's a lot of value to that. But there also has to be a cultural acceptance. You just can't sit on your butt. You can't screw up knowingly, right? You have to try, but it's okay if you fail.
Yeah, that's part of our problem in Germany. We don't like bankruptcy. And yes, here's a question.
You are at the university, and you have a big advantage over many other persons because you are quite free in what you are doing research on. Quite free, I assume. There are, of course, many trade-offs which are obvious for many people. I've made some experience with innovation, creating teams and creating new ideas and so on. If you put the right people together and give them the job to deal with a certain trade-off, I'm quite sure that they will find a solution. But this solution for most people looks, I would say, perhaps strange, perhaps impossible, whatever. And it's really difficult to convince others who might give money to those people to do the work making this big step.
Yeah.
What is your experience? What would you recommend?
I agree with everything you said, except the freedom part. That's a whole nother pizza, so to speak. We can have a whole nother long discussion about academic freedom and freedom to do research and this and that. It's true. To a large extent, yes, we do have a lot of freedom. But there are some other aspects of it that are really limiting at the moment anyway. In terms of coming out into the world with a new idea, Henry Ford, this quote from Henry Ford, and he said, if I asked people what they want, they would tell me they wanted a faster horse, right? So there's a chapter in the book that we call skeuomorphs, where we explore things that kind of sneak in. It's a radically new thing, but it kind of looks like the old thing. See if I can find this. Was it this one? No. I'll just show briefly an example of it, about these new things sneaking in. It's a quick review in case you missed something. This thing here, right? When people were speculating on what an iPhone would be, and they would draw this. And actually, in the early days of the iOS, the operating system, you would have a calendar that had little flippy things, or a little clock that had flippy things, or a notebook that had some binding and lines on it. And totally unnecessary stuff, right? It's a digital medium, but you're kind of making it look like there's something physical to it. So skeuomorphs are oftentimes indications that something big is about to change. And we go into a lot more detail about this. I don't know if maybe I have an extra slide at the end. The difficulty in getting a new idea across has to do with the fact that everything is a system. Everything is a system. And so we have a particular model of a system. There's a saying that says all models are false, but some models are useful. So we think this is a useful model where we break out everything into this 5-component system model, and then we map what's going on. And so Edison, for example, when he, this is not a planted question, by the way. Edison, had this in place. He had electric generators in place. But when he was trying to scale up the electric system, it turned out that the cost of copper was very high. Just to do the island of Manhattan, let's say, to have a lot of customers as opposed to the Carnegie's house, it was very, very expensive. And so he had to go to a high voltage distribution system and parallel sort of split out of the light bulbs and so on in order to drop the resistive losses that would be in the line. Because everybody, until he came along, everybody kept trying to do this at high current and low voltages. But if you go to high voltage and low current, you can deliver the same power, but a lot less resistive loss in the line. But then you end up with another problem, which is down here at the end where the electricity now comes through the wire, and it comes in at a low current at a high voltage into the light bulb. And the light bulb all of a sudden doesn't give off any light. Because in the light bulb, you actually have to dissipate a lot of energy. So originally, Edison's patent on the light bulb was like one in a long line of prior patents on light bulbs. One of the reasons that his was so different and so special was that his light bulb was high resistance, high electrical resistance, designed to work with this distribution system, designed to work with a cost-effective distribution system that used thinner copper wires that was more cost-effective. So there's a system-level introduction of a new idea that actually made it a lot more scalable. He then also introduced a way to measure how much electricity people are using that you could use to control the distribution and shut off the electricity if needed, if somebody wasn't paying or something like that. A patent on the Weber meter. And so when he describes these things, right, so in any system of furnishing to consumers electricity, so he talks about systems. So here's a patent on the light bulb, and it's, again, in my systems of electric lighting. So there's a kind of mapping that happens that's a system-level mapping that identifies all of the necessary components. And so sometimes the issue, right, so in this case, if we look at this, there's something missing, and that's a switch, right? when we look at the iPhone, you're envisioning a system where the iPhone is just part of a bigger network of things that really allows it to expand. And so sometimes there's a practical difficulty in getting a new idea out there because the rest of the system isn't ready. So we explore it in a lot more detail in the book, but there's that part of it. And in a way, sometimes you have to sneak things in because people aren't ready or they can't see the new system coming, right? The wires are underground. Like how many of us knew that there was something special about the voltages in Edison's electric system as opposed to Yablotchkov's electric systems that came before him? How many of us knew that it's really the high resistance of the electric filament that really allowed this to work with that and make it economical, right? Because it's buried, right? The wires are underground, and the light bulb filament is too really small to make sense of, and we're used to it. It's part of the everyday experience, and so when you're a designer, you see things in a way that regular people, users, don't see on a daily basis, right? And that's a difficulty there. And so in some ways, you need to almost introduce a whole system, but it's going to take a lot of capital. And so Apple does this in a very interesting way. If you look at the evolution of the Apple mouse and how it's now a touchpad, you look at each successive generation of the pointing device. They realize this early on, and they change a tiny bit at a time. With every new model, they change only a tiny bit, and tiny bit. So they have 5 to 10 years worth of product already designed and waiting in the wings. But they introduce very small changes with each year to get the consumer to come along. Okay, and sometimes as a designer, that's what you have to do.
You mentioned Daimler. I mean, all of the car companies are in the same spot. They're on top of this one traditional curve. So when you talk with these people, what would you tell them to do practically?
I have a connected question. So my connected question is the future of automotive, electrical accumulators or hydrogen?
Interesting. Do you have a connected question?
I think they're all connected, but
Okay, yeah.
maybe you answer them first.
Well, it depends on how much these auto companies are going to pay me to answer that question. So it's interesting, right? In the system picture, let's say, and this is when you talk about why did in the U.S., for example, why did the auto industry take over the rail industry? And with the rail industry, one of the sins of the rail industry, and there were many on both sides, but one of the sins of the rail industry was that they thought that they were in the business of railroads as opposed to in the business of transporting people, right? Getting people from point A to point B. And I think car companies are starting to realize that, right? So Uber, who's not a car company, Uber, the car for hire company, they're starting to realize that, and so they'll have Uber and Lyft, they'll sponsor, or they'll institute, these electric scooter kind of things where people can, take electric. Ford is starting to get into it, and so on. Why is Google interested in the auto business, right? Google for a long time was really pushing self-driving cars. And one way to look at it is that there are a couple of different systems that are sitting on top of each other. So if you're in the transportation world, if you're in the transportation system, let's say your car company, where do you fit into the system? So you're trying to get goods and services from point A to point B, right? So this could be me going from my house to the university. And I take the road to get there. And while I get there, I'm packaged inside of my minivan. Or sometimes I take my, the hybrid. Depends on whether I have to drop off kids or pick up a lot of stuff, and God knows, right? And I obey traffic lights. Okay, so that's the system. But while I'm driving, I'm texting my wife that don't worry, I can pick up the kids after school today, okay? I'm using voice assist to do that at a traffic light. And so what happens is, so that's the system, right? And that's me in the package in the car. But there's another system that sits on top of it, which is, for example, the information system that looks the same. And so this package over here generates, you can imagine the same kind of thing now oriented this way. So this package now generates a stream of data that's packaged as a text that comes out and goes there. So Google, for example, is interested in the auto business because there's a lot of data originating from here and from here, right, from the whole sort of interaction. And they make money on that stream. They don't make money on this directly. They couldn't care about a self-driving car. A self-driving car is only good because it's going to produce a 10x increase in the amount of data that's generated, right? Think about it. Because if I'm in, let's say an average person drives for like an hour a day, maybe more, what are they doing in the car if they're driving? It's completely wasted time, right? They would rather browse the web, catch up on their emails, or do something like that, right? So if they enable something like that, there's a tremendous amount of data. Now, the car companies, the question is, what business are they in, right? If they're in the business of packaging, right, they're in the packaging business, right? So they need a smarter package that enables that. So the car companies really ought to be working with the infrastructure people on enabling not a dumb highway, right? They need to enable a smart highway that has control somehow integrated in it, that knows more about the car and knows more about the status of the roadway, so that it can facilitate the self-driving car situation, for example, right? And partake in the revenues that are going to be generated from all of this extra data stream, for example, or extra traffic or extra whatever that's going to happen, right? So there isn't, people realize that, but they say, it's too difficult, right? It's too difficult, and so we're just going to stop. So I think whether cars are, cars should be electric. Whether it's going to be hydrogen-based or something else based, that's, in some ways, we'll get to decide later, but cars should be electric because electrification helps with everything else. It just helps get everything else going, right? So I'm kind of interested in these broader system-level concepts for doing that, right? And I think the car companies really ought to be looking at multiple systems that are tied together, that are doing these things. Does that help answer your question, kind of? Kind of. Yeah, they have to electrify, no doubt about it. But maybe people don't actually want to drive places, right? I think nowadays I can have so many phone calls with video and voice that I can just, sit in my office, make a phone call, and then go have coffee with somebody I like, So maybe driving everywhere isn't really the thing to do. So again, if we look at those curves, right? If we look at those, let me get back to these curves. The car companies are right there, right? They're right there. And so we can talk about, electric versus hydrogen from the perspective of a car. And it really won't change anything. It's just optimization. We're just trying to get the 0.2% improvement in something right there, if we do that. I think if we zoom out and see what the bigger system level perspective is, then questions become interesting. We can talk more about it. Yeah.
From your perspective, what is the importance of patents for the success of a company? Or in other words, if I think I've made a great invention, what is the right point in time to get a patent on this invention?
Oh yeah, that's a good question. Like academic publishing, the patent industry, let's call it that, is in a really interesting state. So a few years ago, there was a change in the law, in the US at least, from the priority date of a patent being based on when something was invented, changed to the date on which the patent was filed. And it was an interesting change because it puts certain people at a disadvantage. So if you're inventing a lot of stuff but you're resource poor, you're going to spend longer trying to make sure that you've covered all your bases, so to speak, with a patent before you go to the patent office. A company that has a lot of resources in their IP department, they can afford to just file indiscriminately and all the time to get these priority dates and play games with all the continuations and things like that. And so it's kind of become a science unto itself. That said, the patent system really is written into the Constitution, at least in the US. It's really part of the foundational idea of the country. This idea of intellectual property is just fundamental to how things are set up. And they're really, really valuable, right? And the idea is that you ought to have, if you're going to put in the time and the risk associated with trying to get something new to people and people laughing at you, or somebody with a big factory says, oh, I have a lot of resources, I'm just going to, nice idea, thanks, we're just going to do the same thing, right? It's a really important thing. It's really important for stimulating growth of ideas and technology and things like that. It's necessary. And in some industries, it's much more important than in others. But now we're, I think, in an interesting period of time where the lines between what's patentable and not patentable are really blurred. What I mean by that is that, let's say you have an idea. Just an idea isn't necessarily patentable. You have to, there's this requirement that it has to be reducible to practice, okay? But what's interesting now is about our physical models and models that we can calculate, let's say, on the computer, is that they're becoming much more realistic. So if you have an idea and you're writing a simulation on the computer, you can actually get pretty accurate predictions about what the physical embodiment of that idea is going to do, of that mechanism or of that device or something like that, that circuit layout. You can get really amazing predictions of what the thing is actually going to do. So then I say, okay, well, I'm going to take this prediction, and then I'm going to go to my machinist, or I'm going to go to my fab, and I'm going to fabricate the circuit. And then I'll measure it. And guess what? It does what I predicted it was going to do. Okay, so these tools are so good now that do you really need to reduce it to practice? With a 3D printer, you can design something, right? Using 3D CAD's computer-aided design software on the computer, send it to a 3D printer, and by the end of lunch hour, you go there, and there it is, right? So from idea to physical implementation, that line is now, that's an expressway, right? It's very fast. So what does it mean for something to be reducible to practice, or reduced to practice? That's really interesting. So there's two answers I want to give you, right? One is I think the patent system is absolutely necessary for innovation. It's key, it's essential. For some industries, it's practically speaking more useful than others. But at the same time, I think there's some new developments, right, that make it obvious that we're going to need a revision in how it works. But for the moment, we just make do with what it is, right? So if you're in the pharmaceutical space, for example, yes, the patent structure is respected, generally speaking. And it should be respected, right? Because if somebody does something, a little bit differently, then you have big consequences. Technology industry, people can, if you have a process patent, a competitor can just close the curtain and not tell you anything They say, oh, it's a trade secret, you're not allowed to go in there. And they could be doing what you patented in terms of your process patent, and you wouldn't know, right? So how do you deal with that? So there's the aspect of, patents could be very useful, provided they're enforceable. Provided they're enforceable. Kind of like currency. Currency is useful, provided it's not fake. Right? As long as it's not counterfeit. So the same thing with patents. It has to be verifiable and enforceable. And that can be more difficult in some industries than others. So it's a little bit general, but we can, again, have a follow-up conversation with specifics.
Okay, it seems like everybody has gotten an answer. I think we are left with your book, and we shall certainly test one or the other idea you recommended. I was surprised that you didn't talk at length on something like Steve Jobs' belief in aesthetics, and which is practically beyond technology. It's just merely something that is, outside technology. It's beauty or whatever, the art scene.
Yeah.
And it probably needs America to have a product coming into reaching the topic you give to innovation, that it is so broad that it is actually it's suggesting a system. Sort of it is a very broadly used and consumed item. Yeah, interesting. Thank you very much. Sort of continue your personal conversation.
Thank you.